Welcome to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm your host, Jay Daniels. This week we explore the musical journey of vocalist Roseanna Vitro. Most recently, she put out a digital release of her 1984 debut album, Listen Here. We not only dig a little deeper into the stories behind that album, but we also look at the early influences in Roseanna's multi-decade career. Our story begins with her roots in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Here's Roseanna Vitro.
Hot Springs, Arkansas is a resort city. They have, it's mountain valley water that comes out of the mountains. And, my mother grew up in a little town around Nashville, Arkansas. And she was raised in a family of 10 children. 3 of them passed, but they were all out on a farm. And so when she got old enough, my Aunt Marie, her older sister, had moved to Hot Springs to work at the pancake shop. And so my mother went there after she graduated high school. And my father was a very handsome Italian. And his family hails from Calabria, Italy. He and the Vitro brothers came over from Italy to New York with my grandma Polera, his mother. And there were 7 Vitro brothers, and 4 of them moved to Hot Springs to work with Oni Madden as he was putting together something for horse racing and gambling down there, because they had horse racing. And he had a nightclub called the Flamingo and asked my father, John Vitro, to run it. So there I had my father loved Italian opera, and my mother, Ruby May, all of her family, all of her brothers and sisters sang gospel music. So that was the music of my life. So it was between pizzas with some anchovy and white milk gravy with cornbread and fried chicken. And you put that all together. So we lived, I think, until I was in the first grade in Hot Springs. Then my father, who was interested in some other women off and on, he was a very, like I said, it was a different day. It was almost like the series Mad Men. I don't know if you ever saw that. But at one point, something was going on with one of my babysitters, and so we made a trip to New York, and I met my Italian grandmother and the Italian side of the family, which was thrilling to me. I didn't care for New York. I thought the people were very unfriendly compared to Arkansas. So after a year there, we went back to Hot Springs, but their marriage didn't work out. So my grandmother Hooker, Lily Mae Hooker, and my Uncle Bobby Joe had a new place to live in Texarkana. And in Texarkana, there's Arkansas side and Texas side. And we lived on the Arkansas side. We moved in with my grandma, and it was me and my middle sister Debbie, who's 3.5 years younger than me, and my little sister Karen, and she's 8 years younger. And all of us lived in this one bedroom where my grandma lived in another, and my Uncle Bobby Joe lived in another, in this new housing project there. So we had a very meager beginning, and College Hill School was down the road, and I knew I was going to be a singer from the time I was 4 years old. I was always singing. I sang in every possible situation. In school, there wasn't anything I didn't sing in, and I also was an artist. I was a good painter and drawer, and I was good at spelling. And so it was really great. I entered some talent contests with just a tambourine. I can remember singing a Beatles song with just a tambourine. And so everybody knew me as the singer. And I said to my relatives, if they weren't nice to me, I'm not going to give you one of my albums when I grow up if you're not nice, for the ones that weren't very pleasant.
So are there any that did not get albums when they came out?
Actually, I have a soft heart under my bristle, and I've been quite nice, actually, to all my relatives. And my mother was somebody that was, I always called her mother to the world. You know, there was never a stranger at my house, and anybody I brought home, everyone was welcome. So, no, I was, I was very lucky. My mother was a great role model to me all the way to the end of her life on how to live the golden rule and not have your shortcomings, get to you, that we all have them. So when I finished, I had an early marriage in there because, of course, in high school, everybody was fooling around, and in the church, you're not supposed to fool around. You're supposed to stay a good girl. So I got married the first time at 17, and that lasted about 10 months in Texarkana. And I'll save that story for my book on all that happened there, because, I'm full of colorful stories. So I had one friend who was really a brilliant, well-read woman, Paige Arnold, and she moved to Houston. And down south, the racism was so bad, and I always hated racism. I hated all that hate that goes around. I couldn't understand it. And so it was between going to Dallas or Houston in those days, on which town where you could actually talk to a black person and not get murdered. And, it was really tough, and this was all around starting the Vietnam War time and the hippie whole thing, the country was really changing. And so I moved in with Paige Arnold in Houston to make my way as a singer. And that was my goal, but of course I wound up working at an office supply. I sold pizza, church's chicken, and before you know it, I answered an ad in a green sheet and for a rock and roll singer, and I would go out and sing Janis Joplin songs and Grace Slick songs, right? But I always felt bad. I didn't have a raspy voice like Janis Joplin. I could not make those James Brown blood-curdling screams. So what was very fortunate for me is that there was a bass player in this rock band I hooked up with who said, "You know what? Your voice is too good for this. Have you ever heard any jazz?" And I said, "No, I'd never heard any jazz," and I was about 21 by then. And he said, "Well, I work with this man, Ray Sullinger, and he sings like Mel Torme and Nat Cole. And I just want him to hear you." And I said, "Okay, I'll go." I said, "I know Since I Fell for You, and As Long as He Needs Me." I sang them in school. And I'd heard Misty. So I went to George Dentler's Pier 21 Club. And Ray was, of course, everything that Tommy Clarkson said. He sang like Mel Torme, played piano, played clarinet, played saxophone, played guitar, taught a zillion singers, was the most giving, loving, Christian and yet total jazz hound you've ever seen. What a legion of people loved him. And I sang with him, and he said, "Listen, I don't know what you're doing, but I would teach you for free. And you can come over to my house, and I'm going to teach you a repertoire of jazz songs if you're interested in it, because I haven't heard anybody as talented as you in 10 years, and I would love to help develop you." And I said, "Oh, well, yeah, I've got a bicycle. I'm can ride over to your house." And so he and his wife bought me a couple of dresses, and I started going over there, and I learned my first 20 jazz songs, and then he started putting me on his cocktail hours. And then he introduced me to couple of the guys in town that had some party gigs. And then before you know it, when I really was knowing more what I was doing, he and the community put on a big coming out party for me where all the musicians in Houston were invited, all the jazz musicians. Arnett Cobb was there. And the great tenor player, I got up and sang the Centerpiece Blues, right? Which is on Listen Here, my first record that I'm have just re-released with Arnett Cobb and my first piano player in my band down there, Bliss Rodriguez, blind piano player who went to school with Jose Feliciano, by the way. So this was, I couldn't believe with my humble beginnings that all of a sudden I've got all this support. Jay, I just couldn't believe it. And I was on top of the world. This was all my biggest dream in the world to come true, that I would be embraced. And I thought, I am going to take this energy and support they've given me, and I'm going to make more. I'm going to use as much of my gift as I can. And I put together a little band with the great Scott Hardy, who now plays bass with Leslie Pinchik. And he was a phenomenal, played like Jim Hall and Joe Pass, and was, he was playing with Jack Benny's shows when he was 12. Just a brilliant musician. So he was, and of course he became my boyfriend. He could play in any key. And then Bliss Rodriguez, who had moved from New York down to Texas with a girl, because Bliss is blind, and he had a girlfriend named Laura that he came with, and was a brilliant pianist. Didn't matter if he could see, and and then I put Tommy Clarkson on the bass, the one that brought me to the party, and then a drummer named Mike LaFave, who's now gone on to heaven, and we became Roseanna with Strings and Things. And I had a 2-year. I wound up with the band singing at a street fair, and the owner of Hula Hands Hamburgers had a beautiful club downtown called the Green Room. And he gave us a 5-night-a-week gig for $125 a man at the Green Room, and I developed an unbelievable following, and I started to have radio shows. It was great because I featured people who came through town, and La Bastille was close to the Green Room. So I would go and see Carmen McRae. I would go and see Bill Evans. I invited he and Eddie Gomez and his band over to the club, and I sat and chatted with him. And Bill said, "I love your low notes." And I said, "Oh, God." And then Oscar Peterson, one of my dreams was Ella Fitzgerald sang at Jones Hall in Houston. And of course, I just worshipped Ella Fitzgerald. I just, all the Sarah Vaughan's and Carmen and all Nancy and all these great singers, I always made it a point to go meet them. And so Jones Hall was down the street, and it was a big Saturday night, and Joe Pass and Tommy Flanagan and Ella Fitzgerald and Oscar Peterson and Keeter Betts, the bass player for Ella, all of them were going to be at Jones Hall. So I went down there, and I'm waiting out in front to get in, and then all of a sudden they're bringing in Ella Fitzgerald. And I look up, and I'm like, oh my God, it's Ella Fitzgerald, And I said, oh, Miss Fitzgerald, I just think you're the greatest thing in the whole world, and I just love you, and I've just listened. I go to sleep at night listening to your recordings, and just thank you for being you. And and I'm Roseanna Vitro, and I'm singing down the street. And if you want to come over for a free steak after the concert, please do, because and it was so cute. And she was just like, oh, thank you. She was her beautiful, sweet self that you always imagined, right? So then I'm like, I'm dying. I'm just over the moon. So then we go in, and I finagled going backstage. I can't tell you, Jay, how I did that, but I was crafty. And I'm all dolled up, And what, I'm 25 or something. And I'm, walk by and I see Oscar Peterson sitting there, that big old man with those big hands. And I peeped in and he said, "Are you lost, young lady?" I said, "No. Well, are you looking for someone?" I said, "Yes." I was like, and he said, "Well, can I help you? Well, come in here." And I went in there, and he said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm a singer. I'm singing. I'm a jazz singer. I'm singing down the street at the green room." I said, "And we have great steaks down there. And if you wanted to come by after your gig, I could give you two free steaks. Even somebody like you, I could get 2 free steaks for you." And he said, "Really?" And I said, "We have a great piano, and I have a wonderful, wonderful band, and we play jazz. And really, just come in and ask for me." And so the concert went on, and then I had to go back to the club, and the club was packed. Everybody was buzzing because it was such an exciting night, right? So in walks Oscar Peterson.
He was coming for those steaks after all.
He was. And he comes right in, Jay, and he walks right up to this bandstand through the crowd, and then says, "Can I sit at this front table?" And he was with his manager, and we said, "Yes." I thought we were going to have a heart attack, and so he said, "Well, let's go ahead and play." And we said, "Okay." So we're just like, and so I called "Love You Madly." And obviously, I've worn that song my whole life. And my husband says, "Now you're going to have to stop singing that song. You just sing that song too much." And I said, this was a lucky song for me. So I sang "Love You Madly," and I love to swing, and just swinging as hard as I could. And the band was playing great. And after "Love You Madly," he got up and he said, "Listen, would you play that once more and let me play it with you?" And I said, "Oh, sure." I said, "Sure, I will." So he comes up, and I thought, "Oh, God help us, we get through this." So, and of course, he just, and it was in B flat, so there was no problem. So then after that, and everybody's going crazy. After that, he says, "Well, why don't you sing a pretty ballad with me?" And I said, "Okay." Now, in those days, I really didn't know the difference between B and B flat, in that I never played in B, so I'd never given it much thought. And my band could play in any key, and the guys wrote the charts. So he said, "Okay, well, what key?" And I said, "Well, I sing it in the key of B." And then he looked at me, and he started going through the chords, and he said, "Well, do you mind if I modulate to just B flat for my solo?" And I said, "No." I said, "No, it's okay. If that's where you'd like to play your solo, fine. Just come back to B." Oh, Jay. Anyway, so I sang, it was a song I just loved to sing. I always meant to have it on a record, and I haven't yet, but it was really, really a tremendous experience, and experiences like that are ones that, after this gig at the Green Room ended after a couple of years, I was really famous in Houston, and really my band, everybody knew my band, and they loved my band, and we had, posters and plaquettes of the band, and we played in all these festivals. And so, me and Scott Hardy, we packed everything up, and we sold everything we had, and we had $3,000, and we said, we're driving to New York. We knew one bass player that Bliss Rodriguez knew, David Sibley, and he lived in Brooklyn, and that's all. We had $3,000 and all of our stuff in the van, and we drove up to New York in 1978.
And that's quite an experience too. I mean, the fact that you could get up here, and $3,000 these days might cover some of your rent.
Well, it was pretty funny in the beginning because naturally I do have a Southern accent if I go back home. And so in New York, when the agents met me, we were trying to get work, they wanted to put a cowboy hat on me and had me sing country songs. And I was like, well, I don't have anything against country, but I'm actually not a country singer. Because I could always, I'd sung at all the parties. I'd sung Take the Ribbons from My Hair. Or For the Good Times. I'd said, in a heartbeat, I could do those things. But it was funny, some of the things that as Scott Hardy and I went on our way to, to look for other members in a band. We were at a place uptown on the east side called Friends at one point, where I had asked the musicians we met, who are the two best piano players of the young guys in town? And they said, Fred Hirsch and Kenny Werner. And I said, okay, do you have their phone numbers? And so when we were doing this gig at Friends that paid $50, I could give Fred $50. I called up Fred, and he actually told the story on my recent birthday Zoom. He was part of my birthday Zoom. I called him up and said, hi, my name is Roseanna Vitro, and I'm a jazz singer from Houston, Texas, and Scott Hardy and he's a great musician, and I sounded like the FedEx commercial. And I could give you $50. And he said, I'm going to hang up now and go think about this. I'll call you back. And he hung the phone up. And I said, oh, well, I'm not sure if that went over or not. So then he calls back and he said, yeah, I ask around about you. Sure. They say you're good. So Fred came up with an electric piano. And he also brought his roommate, Ed Felsen, a bass player friend, who they were both from Cincinnati. Ed went on to become my boyfriend for a couple of years, because then eventually what happened is me and Fred and Ed all got a whole loft together down the street from Bradley's. Fred and I, we made 3 records together, and we wrote some songs together. I just love Fred. Fred has a soft heart, and he's been through many, many changes, but his drive and passion and beauty as a musician and someone that supports the community is really fantastic. And I'm so glad to be back in touch with him and having a good relationship. And then Kenny Werner, became, first time I met Kenny, I fell madly in love with him, and we kissed in the Village Vanguard after he just played with Mel Lewis's band. But that lasted about 2 weeks. Then he went on to meet Lorraine Werner, who was turned into one of my best friends. And his daughter, Catherine, who unfortunately passed in a car accident when she was 16, was like my daughter's sister growing up. They lived out by Paul and I, and of course Kenny's best friends with Paul, my husband. And Paul and I got married in 1982. That's a whole other giant chapter where I recorded, this old Judge Moeller from Houston, when I needed to make this first record, Listen Here, sent me $5,000 because I still didn't have very much money. And with that $5,000, I took it up to Skyline Studios that Paul had built, one of the greatest studios in Manhattan, and recorded there with Kenny Werner. And our very first record we made there was not released right away. That turned into Reaching for the Moon later. But then with the judges' money, I had put toward Listen Here, because I had seen Kenny Barron's trio and thought, well, now wait a minute. For the old judge who loved Bill Evans, I had never heard anybody sound like Kenny Barron's trio, right? I thought, this is a level of elegance that I have not encountered. It was, because all of us were younger and we were just zipping around, and then Kenny was like smooth cream, and Buster, he wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere, and Ben Riley was just the sweetest cat ever, just so swinging. What a great guy. Arnett Cobb came to New York to play on that record for $500, a hamburger, and a bottle of vodka.
See, look, I'm noticing a trend here. You gave Oscar Peterson steaks. You gave this guy a hamburger. Notice that the way to a guy's heart is right through his stomach.
Yeah. Always, and I'm a good cook.
So I will be waiting for that invitation. Be like, Jay, thank you for the interview. Come have a steak.
You know what? I'm in South Orange and you're in Harlem. But it's not that hard to get to South Orange, and I've got an incredible kitchen at my new house.
Yeah.
And I've got the cook's kitchen now.
Oh, I do too. I have made many good meals for company here at this place. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I realize that my first beginning of my life is just like a storm, but it all happened before New York, and it really laid the path of me having the confidence and the training and the chutzpah to come to New York, because I had really been emboldened with so much support and love. Now, I have to say, Jay, that New York is a tough nut, and there were many difficult moments in those early days, I have to say, of learning a level of tenacity and some cruelty, backbiting, that I didn't experience in Houston, with the musicians. It's not that people weren't still protective about their gigs, but, there's so many of us in New York, you've got the impact of a fly on somebody's elbow. So, trying to get through the crowd. And Lord knows there's plenty of singers.
There are plenty of female singers too. I mean, they come a dime a dozen these days.
Yes. And some of the young ones are so fantastic. I've always checking out and supportive of the great young singers. And when I hear one, I'll go check out what family they're from. Is their mother a Broadway star? Oh, wow, she must have been taking voice lessons since she was 4. And I'm sure some of the people I'm talking about. I just think it's great, and I will always be supportive of the singer community and great young singers as they forge their path.
So thinking about the album Listen Here, which you have alluded to, this is an important step for you to make. I've released only one album and we had 500 copies printed, and that was 8 years ago. But when you have the players together, Fred Hirsch did the arrangements for you on the album. What was your intent behind this release? I mean, this is the first time a lot of people are going to hear you. So what was your intent behind, the tracks, the sound, the overall product itself?
Classic. I wanted to make a classic jazz album of great songs that had meaning to me. But I'm always looking for every record I've made. I was looking for meaning. That's what you have to in my mind, to make a record that you love, that you're proud of. So no matter what happens to it, whatever people say about it, you gave your very best and you did exactly what you wanted to do. So Listen Here was my, with a classic, one of the greatest trios ever playing jazz. And Arnett Cobb, one of the greatest soulful tenor players. And then to have Scott Hardy playing guitar on Happy Madness and a couple of other things that he played on guitar. And then to have Bliss Rodriguez on Centerpiece. That's the only song Bliss plays on. But I'm kind of the person, I'm very loyal. And so I take people with me. I don't ever forget them, and always honor them and show them I love them and I appreciate them. But it was classic. Listen Here for me was, when I first moved to New York, I started studying opera. I studied opera a couple of years. So I'm singing with a lot of more vibrato than I've used sometimes in later years. And I've always been, I think I told you in the beginning, I've always been studying voice because I just wasn't a perfect singer. You know, I have to go over my vowel sounds all the time. I'm like, oh yeah, because my natural Arkansas thing is very long vowels. But Listen Here, I loved all these songs. I was enamored with Dave Frischberg. You know, when I heard his song Listen Here, it just touched my heart. You know, I just thought, what a beautiful, beautiful composition. You know, and then A Time for Love. That's, you know, it's not an easy song to sing, and there's so many great versions, you know, but still, you know, what a sensational piece of music. And some time ago, the Sergio Mihanovich song, one of the not very well-known songs that mainly jazz aficionados would know. I love that. I love 3/4 Time. No More Blues. I had second thoughts about doing that one because on the record, for me, it's really too fast. And the group, it wasn't really their cup of tea in that kind of, you know, fast samba. But of course, I'm wanting to go in all directions, and it's still, you know, a wonderful piece. I mean, you know, singing that song correctly is something to do. And I always love to be challenged. You know, Lush Life was one of the first songs I loved, you know, going with the headphones on to bed, you know, when I first started working with Ray Sullinger all those years ago. I didn't know when the song was necessarily hard or not. I just know when I heard something and said, now, oh, that sounds like something to do. So all the songs for me are classics. Happy Madness. WBGO had played that song ever since the very first Listen Here came out. So just all classic songs that I just loved. And singing with that trio and just was just heaven for me. So, and I was so grateful.
How do you feel that your work on Listen Here helped to inform your work for later recordings, which there have been many? But what do you think you were able to take away from that session and apply to future works?
I can think of that in terms now, later, at this late date in my life, on when I listen back to it, it's really fascinating after all of my years of recording to listen here again that I sang in 1984. Because, you know, I'm listening to a younger voice. I'm listening to my care of taking my time on the ballads, the level of drama I sang with at that point that I probably curtailed a little bit. I was very influenced by theater, and in my early life, I really could have gone into theater or opera. Because once I started studying opera after a couple of years, I thought, well, if I go any further now, I would need to be serious about opera. And so, but I really admire opera singers. But if you're going to go down that road, you better buckle down and get ready for the long ride, and be serious. And so I knew jazz was really going to be my thing because I just love to swing. And I love beautiful ballads. And so I, as you go along and learn more in jazz and watch the cooler singers, even early on, of course, I knew Peggy Lee's work. I knew what, never know how much I love you. The really sort of breathy talk singing, or the Diana Krall kind of, breathing into the microphone, and deciding, I think in the beginning as a singer, you're deciding, who are you anyway? Because I could copy a lot of people. And so on Listen Here, that was my pure singing voice. Just, when you're still, do you hear? It was just me singing. Nobody else was there but me, for the most part. Some albums, I could trace back to some licks on my Softly record I sang with Fred for Concord, where in So Many Stars that I love to sing, I burst into a Nancy Wilson lick and a kind of a yodel of hers, and I went, oh. And my husband would always, the great engineer Paul Wycliffe, would always say, don't you think that's a little dramatic? And I would say, and then I would decide if I wanted to keep it or not. But on Listen Here, it was just really me and me just hallowing Kenny Barron's trio and just feeling so honored that Judge Arthur Moeller would send me $5,000 and that I would have the money to go into a top New York studio and have Paul Wycliffe, this great engineer that built Skyline, record it, and have Fred Hirsch write these arrangements. All I could think of is how lucky I was and what an incredible, fortunate person I'd been. And I think that now. I've just had an unbelievable life and career and a beautiful family, all of it. I've just had all of it. And, the things that are people who I think have been disrespectful to me, or, as you go along, the people who you wish where they chose you for this and that and the other. I don't know a singer or an artist who doesn't say, well, you always have those disappointments, and then you always have to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, start all over again.
Roseanna Vitro, this week's guest for In Studio from Simply Timeless. Be sure and check out the new digital release of her 1984 debut album, Listen Here. Special thanks to Roseanna for taking the time to chat with me. It was a pleasure getting to hear some of her stories. And thanks to you, our listener, for joining us this week. Until next time, I'm Jay Daniels. You've been listening to In Studio from Simply Timeless.